Digging out from under arrears. I've been very busy, but you're getting back to the Saturday Superlatives going back. Week 5. I'm going to do week 5, week 6, week 7. Bang them on out. Going back to week 5, a lot of quarterbacks really had great performances. And I'm going to mention positively a guy that I have, I'll be honest, I have at times been a critic of. But Bo Nix, even though he threw an interception, only had one touchdown pass, held it together, for lack of a better put it, against a very good LSU defense, at least good against the quarterback. And he 255 yards on 26 of 44, I believe it was. No, 23 of 44. His passing stats aren't amazing, but he managed to convert some key third and even a couple of fourth, I believe, downs. Also rushed 12 times for 74 yards. Had a touchdown rushing, so a total of 2 touchdowns as well as that interception. But he played extremely well even when pressure was on him. So I want to make a quick sort of, hey, and now to some guys that really put up much bigger numbers. Logan Tway, I believe it's how it's pronounced, from Central Missouri, 28 of 34, 405 yards, 5 touchdowns, a long of 65. Also had 11 carries for 31 yards. Dominant. I want to mention some other guys that had great games. Another guy had ridiculous numbers is Bryce Witt of Chuan, 36 of 43, 5 touchdowns. Also had 6 rushes for another 40-something yards, 42, 44, something like that, and a couple of touchdowns. I mean, I think he set or tied a school record for total touchdowns. I think he has, 7 total or something for that game. It was insane. Wake Forest, Sam Hartman, one of those guys that seems to chug along. Now, he's very similar to name a lot of other Wake Forest quarterbacks in that he's, a smaller framed guy, doesn't have a huge arm, but tough, smart, accurate. Not a great game in terms of efficiency, but managed to, once again, play well when he had to. 23 of 40, 324 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. Also had 10 carries for 35 yards and a touchdown on the ground. David Wright of Allen, that's, yes, Division III Allen. But once again, great game. 30 of 57, 455 yards, 4 touchdowns. A lot of shorter passes, a lot of catch and run, but he had a couple of ones where he pushed it down the field as well. I have to mention Hank Bachmeier. Now, he's a guy that's probably in next year's quarterback class in terms of the NFL draft, but don't be surprised if he's a guy that goes from being someone that's not very talked about to really have a really steep rise in next year's draft class. 34 47, 388 yards, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception. He has a really good mix of physical talents. He can move fairly well. He has a strong arm. And as he really settles in mentally, I think he's going to, like I said, have one of those big, maybe not quite Joe Burrow type rises, but a solid one. Kenny Pickett of Pitt just keeps chugging along. 23 of 36, 389 yards, 4 touchdowns. And once again, a guy that went from being not quite Joe Burrow-esque, but a guy that was talked about in the middle rounds last year is going to go maybe in the first, but I think no lower than the second this year. Cameron Ward of Incarnate Word, say that 4 times fast, had a really great game at the office. Great day at the office, 25 of 37, 3 touchdowns. Also had a long of 54, had 6 more carries for 3 yards once you separate out the sacks. Keaton Slovis has gotten a lot of flack this year, but some of it is frankly unfair. But he had a pretty good game, 19 of 29, 276 yards and 3 touchdowns. His offensive coordinator in high school was Kurt Warner. I'm not out to compare people to Kurt Warner, but they have similar strengths and weaknesses as players. Like Kurt Warner, he occasionally holds the ball. Like Kurt Warner, sometimes he refuses to take try to make spectacular plays when he might want to settle for less. But he's got a stronger arm than people give him credit for. He's got a smaller frame, but he's a tough guy, and he can move a little bit. Grayson McCall is one of my favorite quarterbacks in this class, and not a lot of attempts, 13 passes, but he completed all 13 of them. That's hard to do in practice, people. But he went 13 of 13 for 212 yards, a couple of touchdowns, also had 4 rushes for 8 yards, and a long of 11. At the other end of the spectrum, in terms of attempts, we have Will Rogers, right, of Mississippi State, who obviously plays in Mike Leach's offense, where it's pretty much all passes all the time. 45 of 59, 408 yards, 3 touchdowns. There's obviously going to be some questions about how he translates, but he has a lot of the credentials, a lot of the basics you look for in a guy who's probably a backup, but a solid one at the next level. Sort of in a similar vein, Tulsa's Davis Brin, 17 of 25, 355 yards, 3 touchdowns. Here's a guy that very mercurial in terms of how he looks from one week to the next, and that's Malik Cunningham of Louisville. And some people think he's just an athlete, and I think that's unfair. He's a good athlete, but he's looking more and more like a guy who's an athletic quarterback, not an athlete playing quarterback. 19 of 26, 309 yards, a long pass of 75, pass and run, to be honest, but about 43 or 44 yards in the air of 75 yards, also 2 touchdowns, and 14 rushes for 46 yards, another couple of touchdowns with a long of 11. Northern State is a school that we don't talk about very often. Not confused with Western State, that gave us Austin Eckler. But they are not afraid to throw the ball around down there. And 29 of 49, 330 yards, 5 touchdowns, 1 interception, a long of 41, and also 13 carries for 34 yards with a long of 12 yards. Also, here's a guy that I'd wondered where he ended up. And obviously there's more movement than ever with the transfer portal. But I remember Jason Shelley, in his days at Utah, and then he pops up, and I watched him at Missouri State. He went 19 of 27 for 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, 319 yards. Also, as always, he's been able to move. Long pass of 69 yards, but then he also had 6 rushes for 41 yards. He's probably a guy who's best suited for something like Canada, the Arena League, but I think he could develop over time into an NFL backup. Alexander Kostra, Slippery Rock, right? 20 of 22. If not for the 13 of 13 of Grayson McCall, I think that would be the accuracy winner. But 328 yards passing, along with 38, 5 touchdowns. He's got something. Now, I don't know, once again, if he's an NFL guy, but he's a guy I think who plays somewhere professionally. Maybe up north, maybe overseas, maybe arena. But he's very efficient. He's very accurate, gets the ball off his hands. Another guy, this guy I think can play in the NFL, maybe not as a starter, but Cole Johnson of JMU, 33 of 44, 3 touchdowns, also 1 interception for 273 yards. Also, he managed to rush for another 37 or so yards, I believe, on about 9 carries. I think it was 9 carries. But he's a guy that, all the stuff that people talk about when they talk about, why to take a guy as a backup, right? Toughness, adaptability, a guy who has just enough athletic ability to go with, everything he has upstairs. Andrew Ranowski had a pretty good game as well, 23 of 29, 407 yards. Also had 6 total touchdowns, or 6 passing touchdowns, 1 interception. And I want to mention also, now, interest of full disclosure, my undergraduate degree is from Norfolk State University. I wrestled there and even attempted to play football there. Shout out to Coach Bob Hurd, who kept me around sort of as a pet for a little while as a, 5th string safety and L3 on kick coverage. But Jawan Carter, who is our quarterback now, I say Norfolk State's quarterback, has really shown up a couple of times. This is the second time I've been able to mention him. 17 of 31, 294 yards. He also accounted for a couple of touchdowns passing with a long of 70, and that one went about 48 yards in the air. Also had 17 rushes for another 12 yards once you subtract out sack yardage and 3 touchdowns. He's a really good athlete, and he has enough of an arm. He's another guy that really needs sort of a developmental league, but he's got something, and I hope he gets his chance. Desmond Ritter, a guy who will be drafted and probably somewhere around the 3rd round, but could possibly go later, possibly go earlier. A lot of things will play into that, obviously, how the Combine goes and Senior Bowl or whichever All-Star game he ends up. But he was 19 of 32 against Notre Dame for 237 yards, 3 touchdowns, long of 45 yards to, I think, Alec Pierce, if memory serves correctly. Also, he had 10 rushes for another 28 yards once you subtracted out sack yardage. But he's a very good athlete. I've called him, I think, previous on these videos. I think I called him Kaepernick at 33 1/3. A lot of the same strengths and weaknesses as Kaepernick. Once again, back to the sort of smaller school, Bryant's. Ziva Eckhouse, 25 of 49, 335 yards, 3 touchdowns, also had 7 carries for an additional 8 yards and a touchdown. C.J. Stroud of Ohio State, you could see him growing from week to week. 17 of 23 for 330 yards and 5 touchdowns. Khalid Morris of Johnson C. Smith had a great game, right? 20 of 31, 390 yards, 5 touchdowns, a long of 77. He looked great. Once again, a guy that probably doesn't get drafted, well, almost certainly won't get drafted, and might not even get into a camp right away. He might be a guy that needs, once again, to be brought along slowly, but he showed me a lot. I'm thinking of guys like David Watford. I'm thinking about guys like, even a guy like P.J. Walker. They take a while, but he has a chance. I have to mention Bailey Zappe because every week I have to mention Bailey Zappe of Western Kentucky. I know people aren't talking about him in the first round, and I know that part of it's because he's coming up from Houston Baptist, moving up, from FCS to FBS. Maybe his arm isn't the strongest, but it's strong enough. He's accurate. He makes good decisions. He doesn't tend to put the ball in danger. He throws guys open. I'm not sure why people aren't talking about him more, to be perfectly honest. He ought to be in the Heisman Trophy discussion, quite frankly, but I'm sure he isn't because of, Western Kentucky. But he looked fantastic. 46 of 64, 480 yards, 3 touchdowns, and I think he's one of the top 5 or 6 quarterbacks in this draft class. Moving on, Mark Pappas of Morehead State, 32 of 43, 481 yards, in complete control. Set a bunch of school records, and he's on his way, I think, to eventually owning all of the school records at Morehead State. He's another guy that, I'm just keeping, little boxes are being checked. I hope he gets to the right all-star game. Maybe NFLPA. I think he could light it up there and get some people talking about him. Stephen Tyson Bajent of Shepherd. He's impressed me. He's looked good a few times. I had to mention him because I couldn't keep almost having him on the list. He made it this time. 23 of 33 for 336 yards, 5 touchdowns, and a couple of rushing attempts for 6 yards. Also, Mary University. That's right, Mary University, not Maryland, not William and Mary. This is Division III, but he's good. Logan Nelson, 24 of 34, 454 yards. Also had 6 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, a long of 61 yards, 7 carries to 40 yards, and a long run of 22 yards. I know he'll never play a down in the NFL, but he's a terrific college quarterback, and that's what I'm celebrating. Braxton Plunk of Mount Union, who has an outside chance of getting in someone's camp because I think the NFL is pretty familiar with Mount Union's Division III program. But 17-27, 313 yards, 5 touchdowns, a long of 70, also had 2 carries for 5 yards, and a long of 4. Tanner Mordecai, SMU, formerly of Oklahoma. He's a guy, he probably comes back next year, but I think he fights his way at least into the top 10 and maybe top 5 quarterbacks in the next draft class of 2023. 29 of 42, 301 yards, 4 touchdowns, also had an interception, and a long of pass of 42, also 7 carries for 28 yards. Cole Kelley. Now, this is a guy that I think definitely has a chance to play in the NFL. Cole Kelley of Southeast Louisiana, a guy who transferred there from Arkansas. And there's elements of Ryan Mallett, elements of Roethlisberger, elements of Josh Allen. He's a very big quarterback with a big arm, and he can move around. He looked good. 36 of 49, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception, also 17 carries for 65 yards. Maybe the most impressive thing is how well he runs, and another touchdown rushing. Arizona State's Jaden Daniels is another one of those guys that's sort of like DRC, like Dorian Thompson-Robinson at UCLA is a guy that has physically begun to develop more and mentally begun to develop more. I think it's going to develop it maybe to an NFL starter, but definitely worst case scenario an NFL backup quarterback, I believe. 13 of 19 for 286 yards, 2 touchdowns, also 6 rushes for 45 yards and a long of 11. This is a guy who's up for a little sort of tongue-in-cheek award I give each year, and I call it the Yates-Crompton Award, or Crompton-Yates Award, named after 2 quarterbacks, Jonathan Crompton at Tennessee and T.J. Yates when he was at Carolina, who were 2 upperclassmen quarterbacks that I think were amongst the most criticized by their own fan bases, who turned it around and had a strong ending to their collegiate careers. Frank Harris has a chance to win the Yates-Crompton Award, people. 24 of 30, 278 yards. He's at UTSA. 2 touchdowns, a long of 32, also 7 rushes for 22 yards, and he even had 1 catch right, for 3 yards. He's a good athlete. Good thick build on him, 6'1.5" ish, about 227 pounds. Probably runs in the high 4.6s, low 4.7s. And that's a very strong arm. Maybe not elite, but well above average. And the last couple of quarterbacks. Jeremy Hickbottom. Now, I keep wanting to say Higgin, but it's not. It's Hickbottom from Tennessee State. 18 of 34, 301 yards, 2 touchdowns. Also had 10 carries for another 66 yards and another touchdown. He's athletic, even though he's got kind of a thicker build, and once again, it's a good arm on him. Last few guys I want to make sure that I shout out. Ben Bryant of Eastern Michigan. Now, Eastern Michigan is one of those programs that I think a few years ago was considered the worst one in all of FBS, and now people like UMass and UConn, a few others, are fighting it out for that award. But Eastern Michigan's the Eagles are on the rise in beautiful Ypsilanti. 27 of 40, 338 yards, also 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, a long pass of 45 yards. Those are my superlatives for week 5.